Black Panther is the dream of an uncolonized African nation. An African nation that was never conquered by Europeans, that never had its people snatched away and enslaved in European nations or America, that never saw its development reversed or stagnated due to the interference of European nations, America, or other imperialist powers. Black Panther is set primarily in Wakanda, a fictional African nation. Thousands of years prior to the events of the film, Wakanda was struck by a meteorite containing vibranium, a fictional metal with incredible properties. This allowed Wakanda to be significantly more advanced than neighboring countries. The story follows the conflict between two characters and two worldviews. T'Challa, the recently crowned ruler of Wakanda who wishes to keep the nation secret from the rest of the world and continue the policy of isolationism. And Killmonger, who wishes to use the power of vibranium and Wakanda's technology to effectively take over the world to benefit people in Africa and people of African descent in other countries. Killmonger wishes to enforce the policy of colonialism that so ravaged the African continent a century ago. Isolationism is the foreign policy of remaining apart from the affairs or interests of other countries. Colonialism is the foreign policy of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. In the end, T'Challa defeats Killmonger but questions his own policy of isolationism, opting instead to reveal the secrets of Wakanda, not to conquer other nations but to provide humanitarian aid and new technology. Sometimes when nations claim they are only providing humanitarian aid, they are actually hoping to get their foot in the door to enact regime change, but one assumes that T'Challa's intentions are more noble than this and genuinely wants to help the world and begin peaceful relations with other world powers. T'Challa rejects the policy of colonialism, perhaps because it is a policy so intertwined with the exploitation of real-world Africa between 1884 and the early 20th century, a period commonly known among historians as the Scramble for Africa.
Don't scare me like that, colonizer.
Even before his ascension to power in 1865, Leopold II of Belgium had a desire for his country to expand and carve out a piece of the world. He believed that colonies gave modern nations their prosperity, citing examples such as the exploitative Dutch colony of Java. Colonialism is like any business practice for political leaders. There's an investment and an eventual payoff in the future. The loss of life is never factored into the ledger. His father, Leopold I, tried to discourage this to no avail. Years prior, the father's failed investment, St. Thomas de Guatemala, proved embarrassing for him and fatal for those involved. Yet when Leopold II proposed a Belgian colony, he claimed it must be done in his father's honor. Leopold wanted a colony somewhere, anywhere, and eventually fixed his gaze to Africa. At the time, save for investments like the Suez Canal, a few colonies, European nations had little hold or even interest in the continent. Thomas Pakenham, author of The Scramble for Africa, wrote of this, "No continent was less inviting for European explorers. It was nearly 400 years since the smooth, round profile of Africa had first decorated the charts of the Portuguese navigators. For most of that time, the interior, with notable exceptions to north and south, had remained as mysterious as the surface of the moon. In a way, the moon's surface was less mysterious. Europeans could chart its mountains in safety with their telescopes. South of the Mediterranean, the coast of Africa became increasingly hostile. Harbors were rare. Even a sheltered anchorage was often hard to find beyond the curtain of mangrove swamps and the surf crashing down on the coral reefs. It was true that from the time of the Greeks there had been tales of great rivers that led to the interior. The Nile apart, the great rivers seemed a mirage. Up to that point, imperialism among European nations and subsequent colonialism of its conquests stretched out across the globe to everywhere but the majority of Africa. The notable exceptions Pakenham referenced were the Anglo-Zulu War that gave Britain control of Cape Colony, or modern-day South Africa, in 1879, a smattering of French and Portuguese conquests and colonies, and little else. African territories and empires were largely still controlled by their indigenous people. Save for massive gold mining operations in West Africa and the slave trade, Europe thought little of the benefits of the continent. Leopold II, who fancied himself an innovator, concluded he would change that. Leopold became the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State in 1885, a private project undertaken on his own behalf that eventually claimed all of Congo. Europe applauded his efforts under the assumption that Leopold would improve the lives of the Congolese. Leopold ignored the conditions of the Congolese instead, seeing the Congo Free State as concerning him alone. Millions of the natives were killed or mutilated, including children. Loss in the Congo Free State is estimated at 60% of the population. Part of this was due to Leopold's barbaric labor laws. Any Congolese who failed to meet rubber quotas, for example, were executed. Leopold made a fortune in ivory and other resources. Britain's role in colonizing Africa was even greater. Originally content with administering Egypt and control of South Africa, Britain stretched across the Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, as well as a smattering of colonies in the west. By the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled the lion's share of Africa and exploited both its people and its resources. In 1883, Germany established a colony codified by a fraudulent purchase. The indigenous people revolted. As the years went on, Germany massacred the Herero and Namakwa people, inciting the first genocide of the 20th century. Those who survived were put into concentration camps where they were used for human experimentation. About 80% of the Herero population and about 50% of the total Namakwa population either starved, died of thirst, or were worked to death in the concentration camps between 1904 and 1908. There are so many more atrocities, but this is getting extremely grim, so I will try to sum up here. Historians who cite the scramble for Africa as being partially about maintaining the balance of power sometimes leave out that power was not an abstract concept for these nations, but the product of wealth. The colonies' resources provided this wealth and were themselves useful as bargaining chips in international negotiations. The native populations of colonies could be turned into a military force as a means in which to conquer more territories, achieve more wealth, which could then be used to create an even larger military to conquer even more territories, achieve even more wealth, ad nauseum. Britain and France, as examples, used the North African population in their own territorial disputes between them. In other words, European powers conquered the people of Africa to force them into military service to fight one another to gain more African territory for the Europeans. There is no end goal, there is only cycle. So, were there any countries in the real Africa like the fictional Wakanda? Meaning, were there any countries or kingdoms in Africa that were never conquered during the late 19th century and early 20th century period? Yes, but only two: Liberia and Ethiopia. Liberia was already a kind of colony prior to the scramble for Africa. It was made up of recently freed slaves from America, and this connection to a world power may have made it an unattractive target. And Ethiopia was eventually conquered by Italy a few decades after the scramble for Africa period. So yes and no. In Black Panther, Killmonger is introduced during the museum scene. He pretends to be a tourist, asking an expert about the origins of African art. She correctly gives the history of some, but makes a mistake on the last, not realizing it's made of vibranium and originated in Wakanda. This is common among European nations, displaying stolen African artifacts in their museums, thus legitimizing their colonialist pasts. France recently announced that it plans to return 26 works of art to Africa. However, a report from French historian Bénédicte Savoy and Senegalese writer and academic Félouine Sarr says that France houses 90,000 pieces originated from sub-Saharan Africa. The UK and Germany have been considering loaning their stolen artifacts back to Africa, which seems disingenuous considering who historically actually owned them. The scene from Black Panther is a more palatable way of expressing frustration at what Europe actually took from Africa. Not art and religious items, but lives, and the underdevelopment of the African continent. Effects that are still felt today. Black Panther does not exactly have one-to-one allegorical parallels. Killmonger is not merely the representative of revenge against European colonialism, he himself is referenced by Ross as an agent of regime change due to his involvement with the United States Special Forces in one of the most overt anti-colonial moments in the film.
Well, of course he did. That's what he was trained to do. His unit used to work with the CIA to destabilize foreign countries.
Killmonger himself wants to use his power to conquer the world under the rule of Wakanda. The conflict is between isolationism, Wakanda as a hidden nation that provides neither aid nor violence to the world, or colonialism, Wakanda as an imperialist military force to rule the world under the guise of civilizing other nations. It lets the audience see Killmonger present this villainous proposal, and if they reject this as overtly wrong, the audience can also reject the apologia for imperialism and colonialism employed by majority white nations over the centuries. And yes, there are those who apologize for colonialism even to this day, with the excuse that those who were colonized and enslaved were better off in the long run, civilized by the Europeans, even if it meant stripping away their culture. This is bunk. Demonstrably false simply because people do not live in the long run, they live and die in the here and now, but it can also be proven by examining another atrocity: slavery. Enslaving Africans for exploitation in European colonies had its roots in the exploitation of Africa itself, again from Thomas Pakenham. 2/3 of the world's gold supply in the late Middle Ages came from West Africa. In the 14th century, an African Croesus turned up at Cairo on his way to Mecca. He was Mansa Musa, king of Mali, and a man to be reckoned with. He had crossed the desert with 500 slaves in his retinue, and each carried a solid gold staff weighing 4 pounds. Europe welcomed that kind of exhibitionism. Kings and popes depended on gold for more than crowns and chalices. It was then, as now, the ultimate basis of foreign trade. By the 15th century, Portuguese navigators sought to tap the gold by finding a direct seaway to and from West Africa. This would also help them acquire the Indian spice trade and Chinese silk trade if their seaway could extend to the Indies. They founded 2 colonies, Angola and Mozambique, but soon discovered that their gold operation paled in comparison to treasures found in what Europe considered their New World of North and South America. With Europe already established in West Africa for gold mining, it became easier to establish the West African slave trade. The Americas for cotton and sugar, Africa for the slaves to work the cotton and sugar plantations. In Black Panther, Killmonger remarks that he would rather die than be imprisoned, referencing the enslavement of his ancestors. He asks to be sent into the water, much like slaves who leapt from the boats that brought them to the New World. He would sooner die than become a subject or captive of Wakanda. It was actually even more complicated and lethal than that, though. Perhaps a third died during transit to the slave farms of Brazil, America, and the West Indies. Although revisionist history positions the West African slave trade as less military and more business since the practice of slavery already existed in the continent among Africans, the truth is that the process by which captives were obtained by Europeans did not resemble trade. Historian Walter Rodney once wrote of the West African slave trade, "It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. When one tries to measure the effect of European slave trading on the African continent, it is very essential to realize that one is measuring the effect of social violence rather than trade in any normal sense of the word." The fictional Wakanda is presented as an African nation whose people were never taken by the slave trade, and presumably never enslaved each other either. It is prosperous, and though ruled by an absolute monarchy, it is presented in every other way as modern both technologically and socially. Sci-fi elements aside, is this an accurate depiction of an African nation that never saw slavery? Possibly, according to some historians. Although estimates vary, European historians claim that at least 10 million African slaves landed alive in the Americas, Atlantic Islands, and Europe. This is considered a low estimate though, and does not take into consideration the full impact of the slave trade. For example, the figure does not account for those who died in transit, or smuggled slaves, or those killed during the banditry of capturing slaves. Furthermore, this figure does not count the East African slave trade or the Arab slave trade. The figure should actually be many times what European historians often cite as the official count. The massive loss to the African labor force was made more critical because it was composed of able-bodied young men and women. It's like this. Population growth played a major role in development in providing labor, as was seen in Europe and other parts of the world. Without this population growth, Africa stagnated. Example: when the inhabitants of a region in Africa were reduced below a certain number in an environment where disease-carrying tsetse flies were present, the remaining few had to abandon the area altogether and give up development. Slavery affected the value of Africa's precious resource and export, gold. In essence, slaving began undermining the Gold Coast economy and destroying the gold trade. Economic development at the time required the maximum use of the country's labor and natural resources. Historian Walter Rodney also posited, captives were shipped outside instead of being utilized within any African community for creating wealth from nature. It was only as an accidental byproduct that in some areas Africans who recruited captives from Europeans realized that they were better off keeping some captives for themselves. In any case, slaving prevented the remaining population from effectively engaging in agriculture and industry. Thus, a massive population loss stunted development of the continent. Even regions of Africa in which the European slave trade was minimal or even non-existent were affected due to the region's more legitimate trade relations with regions that were more directly affected by the slave trade. A single change can set off reactions in regions that superficially appear unconnected. Therefore, European slave trade was an underdeveloping factor for the entire continent. The fictional Wakanda is the vision of an African nation that never saw slavery. It is hyperbolic and grandiose, of course, and contains a fictional and almost magical resource, but this is closer to what could have been than many seem to realize. Wakanda most likely had the ability to repel any attempts at foreign banditry within its borders. With no massive population loss, Wakanda had enough people to mine their most important resource, vibranium. If Wakanda suffered the severe population losses from the slave trade, even if the nation had not been fully conquered and colonized by a European power, the minimized population would have prevented full-scale mining and may have resulted in being forced to abandon the area containing vibranium altogether due to the ratio of human to tsetse fly population. Only by the presumed fictional weapons used to repel the invaders could Wakanda have survived the attempt at enslavement. Either that or by hiding both its resources and population as seen here. But real African nations were not Wakanda. The real African population was not Wakandans. The offensive idea put forth by slavery apologists and colonialism apologists that Africa eventually benefited economically by the presence of European colonialism and the West African slave trade completely falls apart under the careful examination of history, economics, and even simple elementary mathematics. In the 1950s and 1960s, Africa was effectively decolonized. During World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill convened to discuss the post-war world. The result was the Atlantic Charter. It was not technically a treaty and was not submitted to the British Parliament or the US Senate. It was more of a guideline, a campaign promise of sorts. One of the provisions introduced by Roosevelt was the sovereignty of Imperial colonies. After World War II, the African colonies put pressure on Britain to abide by the Atlantic Charter. Churchill strongly disagreed, but with mounting pressure within his own country, and with the UK broke following the war, they couldn't really afford to fight back anyway. Some African nations gained independence through protest and politics, such as in Ghana and Congo, and some nations fought their own revolutionary wars, such as in Algeria and Morocco. Africa is still putting itself back together after centuries of conquest, colonization, and exploitation by European powers. However, the exploitation of Africa changed over the centuries, but never really ended. Claw laying waste to Wakanda for their most precious resource, vibranium, is not too dissimilar from the supply chain of coltan and cobalt that go from African child labor to American businesses. But that is a topic for another day. Hi everyone, you may have guessed that this was a particularly difficult episode to research and write. Some of the stuff is just horrible, and that's why there's a content warning in the beginning. That's it, and I hope I will see you next week for the new episode. Bye.